Now, in neighboring South Sudan, a humanitarian crisis is unfolding as fighting continues between government forces and rebels. For more, we turn to Africa 54's Ndimyake Mwakalyelye. Ndimi.
Well, thank you, Vincent. Thousands of civilians have fled from the state capital, Juba, in South Sudan, amid fears of new clashes between rebels and government soldiers. Now, according to the United Nations, more than 1,000 people have been killed and 200,000 displaced due to the fighting that started there 3 weeks ago. The president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Moore, ended a 3-day visit to the country overseeing refugee camps.
In this situation, obviously, they left in a sort of catastrophe from the fighting, and they left everything behind, and they came to this new place almost without any personal belongings.
Meanwhile, here in Washington yesterday, Thursday, experts on South Sudan appeared before U.S. senators to explain the current conflict and why the U.S. should stay engaged. For several hours Thursday, members of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee sought answers on the internal conflict in South Sudan that has killed more than 1,000 people. The lawmakers wanted to know why the U.S. should be involved.
Start, if you would, for me, Madam Secretary, with just a quick summary as to why South Sudan matters to the United States.
Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Linda Thomas-GREENFIELD, summed it up this way.
For 30 years, the United States has been supporting the people of South Sudan, even before South Sudan became an entity. We birthed this nation.
The U.S.'s role in helping broker the peace that led to South Sudan's independence from Sudan goes back many years. Thomas-GREENFIELD says the U.S. has to support the peace process underway in Ethiopia and remain neutral in the fight between President Salva Kiir and his former Vice President Riek Machar, whom Mr. Kiir accused of staging a coup.
We are not taking sides. We're engaging all the parties to ensure that there is a process and political dialogue that will lead to a cessation of violence and peace for the people of South Sudan.
Former U.S. Special Envoy to South Sudan and Sudan, Princeton Lyman, says the U.S. and the international community have to help strengthen South Sudan's institutions, including drafting a permanent constitution, so as to avert future conflicts. Lyman says the U.S. cannot back down now.
We've partnered with the people of South Sudan all these years, and we have to stick with it. And the Senate has to understand, too, that means American resources, American diplomacy, American support for peacekeeping is going to have to continue.
John Prendergast of the Enough Project also pressed for continued U.S. support of the peace process and the inclusion of China into the troika that brokered the peace in Sudan. Those in the troika include the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway.
Watching how China has become a much bigger player in the region over the last decade, and how they're actually in Addis now with their special envoy following the negotiations and seeming to be more willing to be more deeply engaged in supporting political reconciliation. I'd say let's open up the tent and start working much more closely, more openly, more directly, more publicly with China.
Many South Sudanese in the audience, while divided in their support for either Kiir or Machar, applauded senators' efforts to address the conflict in their country in the hopes of finding a peaceful solution.
I'm very delighted that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is holding a hearing to get acquainted with the facts on the ground in South Sudan, with the hope that we arrive at a cessation of hostilities.
Meanwhile, in Ethiopia, peace talks remain at an impasse, with the government again refusing rebel demands for the release of 11 political detainees. But despite the stalemate, Ambassador Koch says next year's election will be held as scheduled.